As our gazes connected, the woman's hands quivered with a mixture of dread and hope, and her coffee cup quivered in her palms. Her whispered words, "You're not who you think you are," set my world ablaze. For the last 5 years I had worked behind the counter at the Rusty Mug in Willow Creek, Colorado, a small coffee shop serving lattes and learning the morning customers' orders by heart. The air was crisp with the scent of falling leaves and chimney smoke on this October day. The steam rising from the espresso machine was caught by the sunlight streaming through the enormous front window. Soft clinks of cups, the buzz of chatter, and the odd hiss of the milk frother filled the air. I foolishly believed it to be no more than another Tuesday. Emily Harper is my name. I'm a 32-year-old barista who has a gift for remembering customers' preferences, such Mr. Peterson's black coffee with 2 sugars, and Sarah, the yoga instructor, prefers her cappuccino made with oat milk. Above the hardware shop in a quaint apartment, I reside with Mocha, my tabby cat, and a collection of unfinished sketchbooks. It's the predictable, easy life. Work notebook doodles and movie nights with Sophie. My best friend are my routines. Clara and Robert, my parents, are just 10 minutes away, and are usually prepared with a homemade supper or an interesting anecdote about their gardening endeavors. By this point, I had convinced myself that I knew exactly who I was. I was certain I knew the answer. However, she entered the room the moment after. Maggie Sullivan, whose name I was still unfamiliar with. Her wool scarf draped over her shoulders and her gray hair styled into a loose bun gave her away that she was an elderly woman, perhaps in her 60s. Her voice was calm and collected as she placed her order for a black coffee. Grinning, I smiled and scrawled her name on the cup before passing it over. At that moment, it transpired. She halted as her fingertips traced mine. A subtle thud resounded as the cup tumbled from her grasp and landed on the countertop. I hardly cared that hot coffee had splattered on my apron. A ghostly pallor spread across her face. "Who is Abigail?" Her voice was barely audible as she whispered. Laughing nervously like when someone says something strange was the sound I let out. "No, I'm Emily actually, Harper Emily. I hope to get over the uncomfortable situation by grabbing a cloth and scrubbing the counter." "Sorry you must have me mixed up with someone," I said. But Maggie remained still. Her green eyes, which share a few golden specks with mine, were fixed on my face the whole time. As if the edge of the counter were the sole support for her, she drew forward, her hands trembling now. "Your resemblance to her is striking," she remarked, her voice breaking like fragility. "Mary Sullivan, my daughter. It has been 25 years since she vanished." A blow to the chest was the effect of the words. The sound of the coffee shop's conversation became muted as the rapid throb of my heartbeat filled my ears. Nothing came out of my lips when I opened it to say something. Is something lacking? It's been 25 years. My age was 32. It didn't make sense, did it? I managed to say, "I'm really sorry," but my voice sounded robotic and distant. "I'm not from there, but that's terrible. The creek at Willow. Robert Harper and Clara Harper are my parents. This is where I've spent all my life." Anguish forming in Maggie's eyes, she shook her head in disapproval. "Her gaze is fixed on you." She grinned. "I still have the scar from when I was 6 years old, a little crescent on my left cheek from a swing accident," and she was gesturing toward it with her finger. My mom informed me that. I felt a shiver run down my back. Some have said that my face seems quite similar, like that of a classmate from high school. Everyone knows I'm the type of person who people stop to ask for directions, according to Sophie, who taunts me about it every time. There was a difference, though. Maggie's tone was everything but inquisitive or easygoing. It seemed as though I had just ripped open a long-suppressed wound in her, a raw and desperate expression. Despite my struggles with the cloth, I managed to utter the words, "I have to go," as I retreated. I almost knocked over a stack of to-go cups as I ducked into the back room, but I had to get up and leave anyhow. It was as if the shop had been evacuated and the air had been taken out of my chest. The aroma of dish soap and coffee grinds almost grounded me as I rested my head against the wall. In my mind, Maggie's remarks resounded. "Who do you think you are?" It was absurd, wasn't it? In my own skin, I was self-aware. Willow Creek is the hometown of Emily Harper. An entire existence was in my possession, a birth certificate, baby photos, and all. However, while I remained still, the scar on my face gave the impression of being on fire, and a small persistent voice murmured, "What if she's correct?" Everything I believed I knew about myself would be shattered in that instant, in that stranger's tears, that coffee spill. I didn't realize it at the time. I had no choice but to face the facts, regardless of how prepared I was. On this gloomy morning in Colorado, I awoke to the gentle sound of rain gently tapping against the glass of my apartment. Resting on the pillow next me, my tabby cat Mocha let out a little motor-like purr. I put my phone on the nightstand after groaning and rubbing my eyes. At 7:15 a.m., the screen began to light. Movie night Thursday. Sophie's text blinking at me. An all-new romantic comedy or a grisly thriller, you pick, I said with a smile. Finding a method to lighten the load of a week was always Sophie's specialty. Another message appeared, this one from my mom, Clara. It was a picture of a row of marigolds that she had planted in her garden recently. The text read, "Happy Tuesday, sweetie. What about Sunday night's dinner?" My bare feet sank into the chilly flooring as I forced myself out of bed. In downtown Willow Creek, I had a tiny flat that was all mine. It was located above a hardware store. It had that warm, lived-in vibe, thanks to the exposed brick walls, the drooping couch I got from a charity store, and the shelves full of sketchbooks and half-dead plants. A chipped handle mug beckoned me as I stomped to the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and took it out. In the midst of boiling water, I gazed out the window at the foggy street below. Just a handful of pickup vehicles and an occasional jogger braved the weather as Willow Creek remained calm at this early hour. Despite my lifelong self-perception, I am Emily Harper. The Rusty Mug is a great spot for locals to catch up over coffee and visitors to take pictures of the blackboard menu where I work as a barista. My job may not be glamorous, but it covers my rent and gives me plenty of free time to sketch. I enjoy drawing landscapes and occasionally portraits, but I'm too embarrassed to show anybody except Sophie. Someone informed me that I've lived in Willow Creek all my life. Just 10 minutes away on Maple Street in a yellow house were my parents Robert and Clara, who brought me up. Mom is a former librarian who is constantly praising poetry or tending to her flowers. As a mechanic, Dad is capable of fixing anything, yet he becomes embarrassed when asked to use a smartphone. I couldn't ask for better parents. They're always there for me, whether I need a hug or a funny dad joke. However, this chasm has persisted throughout, as if it were an elusive piece of my narrative puzzle. The years leading up to Willow Creek are rarely discussed by Robert and Clara. They claim we spent some time at a little town in Nebraska, but I can't put my finger on it. The moment I inquire about specifics such as the location or the nature of my first birthday, they shift the conversation away from me. So long ago, Mom would say, waving her hand. It never really concerned me that we lost most of the old photographs in a basement flood. Just yesterday, I took a few sips of my honey-sweetened tea, trying to dispel the recollection of Maggie Sullivan's voice. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? You are not who you believe you to be. A bereaved lady recognizing specters in the face of a complete stranger. I put my coffee down, put on my worn-out Denver Broncos hoodie inherited from my dad, and laced up my trousers. I had to be punctual because work started at 8. I spotted something strange in my mailbox as I secured the door. A simple white envelope devoid of any stamp or return address rather than the typical bills or junk mail. On it, in clumsy handwriting, was my name, Emily Harper. My clumsy fingers shivered as I ripped it open. "Ask your parents about Abigail," were scribbled in bold black ink on a single sheet of paper that was within. I felt queasy. "Hi there, Abigail." All night long I couldn't shake the name that Maggie had murmured. With shaking hands I slipped the note into my pocket. It was most likely an elaborate hoax, then quite an unusual occurrence. However, that persistent voice in my mind became even more audible as I trudged to the Rusty Mug, the rain seeping through my jacket. Is it possible that it wasn't a coincidence? What if the foundation of my seemingly regular life, the coffee shop, the yellow house, and the parents I adored, was something I couldn't fathom? I entered the cafe to the sound of a jingling bell and the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee enveloping me. Before greeting my first client, I put on my apron and cheated a little. Nonetheless, I carried the letter with me like a flame, and the image of Maggie's tear-stained face never left my thoughts. Even though I didn't realize it at the time, the envelope was the first clue that my life as I knew it was coming to an end. Midday slowdown had left the rusty mug noticeably less bustling than normal, with only a few of regulars perched in the corner tending to their coffees. My thoughts continued to wander to that letter as I slowly spun the towel around the counter to wash it clean. Ignoring the comments was like ignoring a splinter, so I told my parents to ask about Abigail. Sophie was the only one I hadn't informed about it. I was at a loss as to how to describe something I didn't comprehend. I was abruptly pulled out of my reverie by the sound of the doorbell. Entering, Maggie Sullivan had a weathered leather bag over her bosom, and her gray hair was soaked from the rain. I felt a knot in my gut as her gaze locked with mine. I wanted to hide in the shadows and act as if I hadn't noticed her, but her unwavering stare kept me still. To Emily she whispered with an impassioned appeal, "Shall we have a conversation for the moment, though?" Looking at the clock, I was unsure. Jake, one of my co-workers, was taking a break in the backyard. No need to flee. "Absolutely," I said, my voice straining to form the words. "To start, I'll grab a coffee for you." She gestured with her hand to indicate her disapproval. "No, I'm grateful. Place the bag on the counter." She then removed a little picture album, the cover of which had faded to a muted blue, and presented it to you. As she gingerly opened it, her hands quivered, exposing a photo of a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, with a mischievous grin on her face, complete with gap teeth. Similar to mine, her dark eyes gleamed with golden specks. There was a little curved scar on her left cheek, the very same one that I had traced 100 times in the mirror. Maggie introduced Abigail, her voice quivering with emotion. "My little girl, conducted 3 days before to her disappearance." Trapped in a spell, I gazed at the photograph. There was more than meets the eye. In fact, it was I. The same snout and nod of the head. The counter was cold under my fingertips as I held it. That's impossible," I said. Another photo appeared as Maggie flipped the page, Abigail riding a scarlet tricycle with a shiny helmet slung over her head. She casually mentioned that the girl was 7 years old. We found ourselves at a Denver park. I looked away to take a call from my sister, who wanted to know what we were having for dinner. "It will only take you 5 minutes, Emily." It was as simple as that. By the time I turned around, she had vanished. I could practically picture the scene she described in her writing, verdant grass, the sound of swings creaking, a small child riding away. And then, nothing. Hardly did I swallow. "Maggie, I deeply apologize. My God, it is terrible. However, she is not me. Forget it." Once again she rummaged through the bag and extracted a little bracelet, a string of wooden beads embellished with a single charm that bore the name Abby. "This belonged to her," she remarked. "It remained on her whole time." A star-shaped mole peered over my collar and she gestured towards it. Abigail possessed one identical to it. There it is. As my heart rate increased, my wrist instinctively went to my neck. I'd always enjoyed that mole since it was different, a quirky thing about myself. But what knowledge did she have? I thought I'd seen a bracelet similar to it before, hadn't I? Underneath the Christmas decorations at my parents' house was a box of antique knickknacks. According to Mom Clara, it was only a friend's present, nothing extraordinary. With a quiver in my voice, I said, "I don't understand." "My name is Emily Harper. My family and I moved to Willow Creek from Nebraska when I was born. My parents—" I stumbled over my words, the words from the letter whizzing through my thoughts. "Contact your parents." Maggie's gaze softened, yet a ferocity remained. "Emily, I've been trying to find her for 25 years. Regardless of the number of missing kid posters or news reports, I persisted. until I laid eyes on you. No, it's all over your body. You know it when you tilt your head when you're thinking, or when you chuckle. It is said that a mother knows her child by soul. My tongue felt parched and lifeless, and I wanted to protest to tell her how wrong she was. Between us, the album lay open, and Abigail's face stared up at me like a reflection from a bygone era. "What is it that you need from me?" In a low voice, I eventually inquired. She pushed the album in my direction and said, "Keep this. Look at it. Let that sink in. We can chat again if you're up for it. I simply want to make sure you're all right." Nodding, I accepted the record with numb hands. Maggie smirked at me in a melancholy way as she walked away, leaving the bell jingling in her wake. As I stood there, the warmth of the shop dwindled and a chill crept into my very being. It was all a coincidence, right? The scar on my face, the mole on my neck, and the bracelet in my parents' attic. My fingertips brushed against the letter in my pocket as I slipped the album beneath the counter, but a sharp and persistent concern nagged at me. What if she's right? After the rain subsided, the streets of Willow Creek became slippery and glistened in the light of the lamps. With Mocha snuggled up on my lap, I settled into my couch. On the coffee table, I had the picture book from Maggie Sullivan open. Abigail's gap-toothed smile hit me square in the stomach as her face locked with mine. All day long I fought the want to think about anything other than her eyes, her scar, the bracelet, but the record kept drawing me back like an unstoppable current. In my pocket I had stashed a letter that I was too chicken to show anyone. My fingertips caressed it. I took it out and the paper was crumpled from all the handling. "You should talk to your parents about Abigail." The text was carefully typed without a signature. "Find the music box with the lavender engraving." I wasn't paying attention to the first statement since I was so terrified, but suddenly I saw a second one, a music box. Neither my parents' house nor mine had one, and I certainly didn't have one. My skin prickles because of how particular it is lavender of all things. I took my car keys and headed to the yellow house on Maple Street where Robert and Clara lived. The porch light was like a beacon. I happened to have an extra key on hand, but they were at a book group. As usual, the aroma of freshly made cookies and lemon cleanser wafted through the home. With my pulse pounding, I quietly made my way to the attic and began sorting through boxes of old clothing, seasonal decorations, and toys from my youth. A little wooden box with exquisite lavender sprigs carved onto its top lay behind a stack of dusty comforters. Upon opening it, a gentle twinkling tune erupted, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." The familiar notes enveloped me, causing my chest to hurt. I vaguely remembered a man's warm, deep voice singing the song to me while I slept. It was like a dream that was fading away. No Robert, some other individual. As I shut the box, my hands quivered in response to the deafening quiet that followed. From my house, I contacted Sophie. I said, "I need you," as my voice quivered. After 20 minutes, she returned to my doorstep, her black hair still in an untidy bun and wearing her teacher's jacket. I ruined Maggie's CD, the letter, the music box, and everything in it. With wide eyes, Sophie listened before snatching up my laptop. "We should look for Maggie on the internet, check her credentials." There was no delay in locating her Facebook profile. Willow Creek's Maggie Sullivan, a former nurse. She posted selfies with her grandkids and pictures of her garden, but the album titled "In Memory of Abigail" was the one that really got to me. As soon as I clicked on it, I was transported back in time to see Abigail celebrating her birthday, riding her tricycle, and clutching a teddy bear. It was as if every picture revealed a part of my past that I had forgotten about. Or had I? Were the lyrics and the man's voice authentic? Emily Sophie whispered softly, "You must speak to your parents. Also, Maggie, this cannot be disregarded." A knot of terror formed in my gut as I nodded. Both Robert and Clara adored me. In addition to teaching me to drive and cheering me on in school plays, they had tucked me in. However, when the lamplight reflected off the lavender carving on the music box resting on my table, I couldn't help but feel that it concealed a reality for which I was unprepared. In reality, who was I? With its porch light flitting nervously, the yellow house on Maple Street appeared tiny against the gray Colorado sky. I rapped on the door while holding the music box, the cold carving of lavender on my hands. When Clara opened it, her normally radiant smile waned in recognition of my face. "My darling Emily, what's wrong?" "I never heard from you." As I entered, the scent of her lavender candles flooded my senses like an ethereal recollection. Wearing his spectacles on his nose, Robert sat in the living room engrossed on the newspaper. "Hey, little one," he said, raising an eyebrow. His hands went limp when he heard the crinkle of paper from the music box. "We should have a conversation," I murmured, my tone much harsher than intended. As I placed the fragile music box on the coffee table, I could feel its haunting melody wailing inside my mind. From where did this originate? "Oh, that old thing," Clara said, her gaze briefly shifting from Robert to me. "It was probably your grandmother's. I am a Nebraskan." "Why?" Like a thread on the verge of snapping, her voice sounded too high. "Please don't," I pleaded, my voice wrought with anxiety. "Be truthful with me. No more." With a shaky hand, I withdrew the note from my pocket, its words wavering. "Ask your parents about Abigail." "Abigail? Who is she? What gives this stranger the idea that I am her kidnapped daughter? By the way, why did you stash this music box in your attic?" With a gasp, Clara's fingers rushed to her lips. As if he were treading water, Robert rose slowly to his feet. "Calm down, Emily. You're feeling down, and do you feel upset?" My voice rose as I interrupted him. "I was abducted 25 years ago by a lady named Maggie Sullivan, and she claims that I am her child. She has mementos, a bracelet, and a scar that is identical to mine. And now this package, this note. You were warned, weren't you?" As tears welled up in Clara's eyes, she collapsed into the couch. "Our intention was to shield you," she said calmly. "You did not yet exist." "I don't understand what you mean by protect from." My hands were trembling as I demanded, "What is real, my actual relatives?" Robert, who had a weathered face, rested a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Emily, it's not what you expect. You were adopted by us, from a legal standpoint, from a buddy of a friend in Nebraska. The rumor mill had it that Mom couldn't handle raising you." He hesitated, his voice quivering, "and we refrained from asking questions because having a kid was our deepest desire. You were the answer to our prayers after all these years. Given up." The flavor of the word was harsh, like coffee that has been simmered for too long. Why then would you want to keep it hidden if you're going to lie about anything? Why not about the flood in Nebraska? With her hands twisted in her lap, Clara cried. "We were worried that you could feel unwelcome. If we could just give you a fresh start, we believed things would improve. We preserved the box and the documents in case you should require them." "Do you need papers?" I lost it. "Which documents?" "Take a look at me." After a little pause, Robert made his way to the study and brought back a metal box that was securely secured. As he passed it over, he avoided looking me in the eyes. No one ever looked inside. "We couldn't believe the woman who claimed ownership of you when she gave you to us." As I fixed my wrath on the box, a chilling terror crept up my spine. "You allowed me to live a lie," I whispered. "You caused the disintegration of another family." Clara extended her arm toward me, but I retreated. "Please, Emily." As my eyesight became cloudy from tears, I cried out, "I can't do this," and reached for the locked box and the music box instead. I screamed, "Not now!" As I slammed the door behind me, the sound resounded like a gunshot. As I sat in my car, the rain picked up speed once again. The boxes weighed more than they ought to have. My parents' falsehoods validated Maggie's haunting words, "You're not who you think you are." That closed box, though, contained what gave me the impression that opening it would destroy what little I had left. The rain-slicked highway whizzed by as I clung to the wheel, making the journey to Denver seem never-ending. Quiet and hefty, As if it contained a bomb rather than papers, the lockable metal box rested on the passenger seat. With Abigail's image seared into my consciousness, I carried Maggie's picture album in my purse. All I could think about was Robert's justifications and Clara's weeping. I hadn't eaten or slept in days. They were in the know. Perhaps not all, but enough to keep the secret for 25 years. I parked in the lot of a little library on Denver's outskirts. The brick building was weathered but inviting. "My daughter Lily wants to meet you," Maggie had cautiously texted me that morning. Like Abigail, she has been searching for her. I really did not want to go, Emily. All you have to do is listen to her. I just wanted to toss the CD, the music box, and the box itself into a river and act like nothing was wrong. However, the scar on my face and the mole on my neck were making it impossible for me to forget. Dust and ancient volumes wafted through the library. A woman with gray streaks across her black hair and a combative stance stood at the reference desk. Lily Sullivan, who is 37 years old, is Abigail's sister and Maggie's oldest daughter. Her emerald eyes, which had a hint of golden shimmer, met mine as she pivoted. There was a brief moment when I recognized Maggie in her face, and then something else. "What about Emily?" She spoke with a steady but raw voice. She said, "Hi, I'm Lily. We appreciate your presence." While protecting myself with my purse, I nodded. "You had information," Maggie mentioned. Speaking about Abigail. A laptop, some folders, and a table in a peaceful nook were her indications. "A journalist," she declared as she took a seat. "When people go missing, I investigate. This is more than a job, it's a personal matter. Abigail was the younger sister of my. She vanished when I was 10 years old. Seeking her has consumed me for all of my life." A folder was opened by her, and yellowed newspaper articles were revealed. One headline screamed, "Local Girl Vanishes from Denver Park," printed in June 1998. Grass covered 7-year-old Abigail's tricycle in a blurry shot. A police report detailing Abigail's features, brown hair, green eyes, star-shaped mole scar on her cheek, was another paper that Lily slipped over. Even though my heart was thumping, my fingers kept going to my scar. "This is how she would appear now," Lily remarked, pulling up a computer representation of Abigail at 32 years old, complete with the effects of aging. My driver's license picture may have been it. Distinct features, identical eyes, identical jawline. In a state of shallow breathing, I retreated from the laptop. Nothing is proven by this. I see a lot of folks who are very similar. A quiver escaped Lily's lips. "I was expecting you to say that, so I brought this." She withdrew a fragile-looking notepad. Diary of Abigail. Being a beginner writer, she found great joy in the process. Take a look at this page. My shaking hands allowed me to open it. "Lily says I'm her best friend" was scrawled in a juvenile style of handwriting. "I adore her," I said, my voice choked with anger. The phrases seemed familiar, like a dream echo, even though I couldn't recall writing them. "Our dad Thomas never recovered," Lily whispered. Although he passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack, the true cause of his death was the overwhelming anguish he endured. He would relentlessly pursue each lead or sighting until he was exhausted. I said I will keep searching. With her intense gaze, she leaned forward. "Listen, Emily, I get that this is a lot. Well, we can definitely find out. An analysis of individual DNA. That one was turned in by Maggie previously. We will know in a few of days if you are willing." The screen, the notebook, and the clippings held my undivided attention. I wanted to run away and cling to the life I knew, the one with Clara's embraces and Robert's terrible jokes. Still, there was a part of me that craved explanations. It was the one that dreamed of Twinkle, Twinkle. "All right," I managed to mutter at last. "It's my job." Lily's gaze remained unwavering as her face loosened. "I admire you. No matter what occurs, Emily, you should always be told the truth." The weight of Lily's remarks weighed on me as I departed from the library, the metal box remaining unopened in my car. I didn't think I could keep running away from the truth much longer. It was rushing at me fast and unstoppable. What did that box contain? For what reason did I sense that Abigail was becoming nearer than before? Outside Clara and Robert's house, I parked my car while the rain pounded on my windshield. It was as if the yellow light from their porch light had become a deception, concealing truths that I couldn't erase. I was unprepared to confront the enigma that lay within the closed metal box that rested on my passenger seat. The music box with the lavender carving, Lily's diary, and Maggie's album were all gnawing at me, wanting answers. More was required. The home was silent, but for the sound of the kitchen clock as I secretly entered with my spare key. Their absence was a little mercy because Robert and Clara were at a neighbor's potluck. After their misleading statements on adoption and Nebraska, I was afraid confronting them would be too much to bear. I skulked down the basement, my sneakers making a screeching sound on the wooden floor through an air heavy with mildew and dust. It was a hoard of boxes, my childhood art projects, old tax records, and Christmas lights. I began to dig my hands out, pacing my brain, consumed by an unidentified desire. I discovered it behind a pile of moth-eaten blankets, a rusty tin container about the size of a shoebox, with a dented and scratched lid. As I pried it open, the hinges creaked and my heart thudded. There was an infant's pale blue frock inside the hem of which had little butterflies stitched into it. The fabric was old and plush, making it ideal for a young girl to play dress-up in. As my fingertips delicately followed the threads, a chill went down my spine. Even though this wasn't yellow, the words "Abigail was wearing a yellow sundress with butterflies" resounded in my mind, as if they were a message or a link to a girl whose identity I couldn't place. I put the dress in my luggage and drove to the Rusty Mug. I texted Maggie to come meet me. 20 minutes after that, she showed there, her expression tired but optimistic. My hands quivered as I delicately moved the garment across the countertop. In the basement of my parents' house, I discovered this. Who owns it? As Maggie delicately caressed the cloth, her breath stopped in her throat. She flipped it over and tears streamed down her face as she saw a little tear close to the collar. "I hand-sewn these butterflies," she said, regarding Abigail's 6th birthday. Her voice quivered as she clung to the clothing, expressing her love for them and how they gave her a sense of flight. "Emily, where did you find this?" The words "my parents" from my lips as my throat got constricted. Despite their claims of adoption, there is something they are trying to hide. Also, they never opened the lockable box containing the papers. So the argument goes. Maggie's intense and vulnerable gaze met mine. "You're practically touching the truth. Hold on for a second." Even though I agreed, a wave of wrath washed over me, directed not at Maggie, but at Robert and Clara. With the outfit and music box at my side, my determination becoming stronger, I returned to their house by car. Their voices echoed across the house, signaling their return from the kitchen. Slamming the garment onto the table, I burst into the room. "I don't understand. What gives you away that you're wearing Abigail's dress?" With a gasp, Clara's coffee mug fell to the floor and shattered. A flush spread over Robert's cheeks. "This was purchased in a flea market," Clara stuttered to Emily. "So long ago, it was only an attractive garment. Averse the reality." I yelled, my voice trembling across the room. Maggie knew what it was. She prepared it for her missing daughter. "Please tell me how it got here." With his hands covering his face, Robert collapsed into a chair. "We were unaware," he murmured. "The woman who gave you to us claimed ownership of the clothing and handed it to us as well. We dismissed it as insignificant. I lost it." "You were handed a lost girl's garment without ever inquiring about it." As Clara cried out and reached out to me, I pulled away. Sitting silently between us, the garment betrayed itself with its butterflies. My heart was racing with an unnamed reality when I took it and ran away. There, the secured container sat my vehicle, and I had a feeling that whatever was there would either bind me or liberate me. I was sent a stark email with the subject line, "DNA results available." It had been 10 days since I'd swabbed my cheek in that Denver library, with Lily's encouraging look pushing me along. For 10 nights straight, I couldn't sleep, the haunting melody from the music box playing in my nightmares, and the specter of the blue frock with the butterflies folded up on my dresser. With my thumb tethered to the notification, I fixated on my phone. Cold and starry, the streets of Willow Creek were deserted, as the rusty mug remained closed. Ignoring the tempest brewing within of me, Mocha purred on the couch. Forever becoming Emily Harper, secure, beloved, and sure, I longed to erase the email. However, I was prevented from doing so due to the mole on my neck, the scar on my cheek, and the tears of Maggie. It happened. Upon loading, the screen displayed the result: 99.9% match. Abigail Marie Sullivan was my name. As I felt the room spin around me, I let out a series of short, piercing breaths. I fell to my knees on the cold tile floor of the restroom and sobbed uncontrollably. My tears were not of sadness or joy, but of something else entirely, as if I were evaporating, reassembling, or transforming into an entirely new person. Snatched from a park at 7 o'clock, I was Abigail. My name was Emily, and I grew up in a yellow house full of love. The weight of being both was too much for me to bear. The metal box, which had been secured since Robert and Clara confessed, lay on my counter. Using a screwdriver, I snatched it open while my hands trembled. The contents included weathered, wrinkled, and musty-smelling papers. Legal documentation attesting to the birth of Abigail Marie Sullivan, Denver, Colorado, May 15, 1993. Baby Sullivan is scrawled in smeared blue on a little hospital wristband. A baby girl's half-open eyes and a faint star-shaped mole on her neck are captured in this Polaroid photo. This is my neck. I drove to Robert and Clara's house, clutching the frock and box, my thoughts consumed with the DNA findings. Despite the late hour, far beyond 10, the light from their porch continued to shine. My key is still with them, so I just strolled in without knocking. Robert sat at the table reading as Clara washed the dishes. The air was heavy with fear as they stood still upon seeing me. "I know," I said, my voice quivering with fear. "Sullivan here, Abigail. I can verify it with DNA. I thought you knew I was taken." A plate fell from Clara's hand and the sound resounded like a gunshot. Crying, she frantically reached for her lips. Robert rose to his feet, his pale face betraying his inability to conceal the truth. We were unaware, at least initially. "Emily, please." At first, what? The birth certificate was slammed onto the table as I yelled. "Her clothing and documents were in your possession. You renamed yourselves Mark and Sandra instead of Robert and Clara, and you relocated us to Willow Creek. In the end, you based my entire existence on deceit." Crying, Clara collapsed onto a chair. "We will never be able to have a family," she muttered. "Emily, 3 babies lost in the womb." Then a lady Robert's cousin came up and said she knew a little girl in need of a family. They said Mom had departed and Dad was unsuitable. To a large extent, we trusted her. For the most part. With tears welling up in my eyes, my voice quivered. "You came across posters about children who went missing. They wanted to see my face." For 25 years, Lily and Maggie looked for me. Robert's speech was hardly heard as his shoulders drooped. "We needed help badly. You were lovely and wonderful. You were our savior," we assured ourselves. "Emily, we adored you." "We still do." "Is it love?" My voice seized up. "You disintegrated a family. With the accusatory butterflies adorning the frock, I hurled it at their feet, claiming that you let me to live a life that wasn't mine. This belonged to Abigail. Like a prize, you hoarded it." My heart was breaking as I retreated as Clara extended her arm toward me. I snatched the box and documents and bolted for my car as the night engulfed me, screaming, "I can't be here." You could say it like that. I couldn't bear the truth on my own, but now it belonged to me, Abigail, Emily, everyone. I had a plan, and Maggie and Lily were waiting for me. A gentle afternoon light illuminated Willow Creek Park, casting a picture-perfect glow over the park's golden grass, swinging children, and rustling autumn leaves. With my hands buried in my Denver Broncos sweatshirt and the music box concealed in my backpack, I stood beside the picnic tables. Maggie Sullivan had requested that Lily and I meet here so that we could begin a new chapter in our lives. No longer was terror pounding in my heart. Rather, it was a curious, frail hope. The DNA findings, the birth certificate, and the garment had shattered my world, but perhaps I could put it back together again. Before everybody else, Maggie rushed over to me, her gray scarf billowing in the wind. Tears glistened in her green eyes with those golden flecks, yet her smile was as comforting as a fireplace after a cold winter. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice quivering before finally opening her arms to Emily. I felt my chest tighten as I walked into her embrace, a familiar sensation. "I've longed for the chance to embrace you once more," she murmured. "Abigail, my dear." With my jaw clenched, I retreated. What I really wanted to say was that I wanted to hold on to Emily. It's my identity. My name is Abigail as well. Both of those things are appealing to me. Magdalene nodded, her emotions exploding. To be or not to be is entirely up to you, every time. Lily came over to join us, a modest grin easing the edge of her journalistic edge. A new photo book, not the old one, was in her possession. It had images of various relatives of the Sullivan family, including cousins and aunts and uncles who I had never met. "We've got a big crew," she remarked, her voice conveying both lightness and intensity. "They can't wait to see you." The album was open between us as we sat at a table. Thomas, their dad, my dad, who has been gone for 5 years now, was seen with gentle eyes on the photo that Lily pointed to. "He would have adored you," she added. The recollection of that song, which was faint but genuine, awoke inside me, and I gripped the music box more tightly as he used to sing "Twinkle, Twinkle" to you every night. The Sullivans were mentioned by Maggie and Lily. We talked about Christmas mornings, family picnics, and anecdotes of Abigail and me chasing fireflies and pleading for more cookies. It was as if I had stepped into a world I had only imagined, and yet to my amazement every little thing fit just right. "We kept searching," Maggie remarked. "It hasn't happened once." The yellow home, Robert and Clara, and the falsehoods they had spoken all sprang to mind. The court was kind because of their age, good parenting, community service, and probation, which mitigated the severity of the accusations, custodial interference, and identity fraud. Putting them behind bars was never my intention. They adored me, brought me up, taught me the piano, and took me camping every summer. However, they had also taken me and caused Maggie's family to fall apart. Since then, I'd only seen them once at a formal dinner where we skirted the issue of honesty. Now they were in treatment, trying to make sense of their options. I was on the same boat. Squeezing my hand, Lily extended hers across the table. "I don't think you should have to pick Emily. You are welcome to have either family name or both. Whenever you need us, we're here." My eyesight was clouded by tears as I nodded. I tried saying, "Emily Abigail Harper Sullivan," to see how it sounded. They were cumbersome to say, yet they fit well, connecting two worlds. While strolling across the park, Maggie delicately placed the wooden bracelet which belonged to Abby onto my wrist. The gentle clicking of its beads served as a constant reminder of my past and future selves. A cookout was being planned by the Sullivans to welcome me, giving me the opportunity to meet the family who had been searching for me for all these years. I wasn't quite prepared to address Maggie and Lily as Mom and Sis, but I was eager to begin. I was both bound and released by the truth which had shattered me. In those moments, I was Emily Abigail, loved, lost, found, and mending. I knew I had finally arrived home in both my identities in both lives, as the sun dipped low, blazing the sky with fire. Now the rusty mug had a new significance. The familiar sound of coffee grinders and conversation was more than just ambient noise. It was a link to the life I was re-establishing. Standing behind the counter, I changed from my Denver Broncos hoodie to a new apron as the wooden bracelet which belonged to Abby clicked gently on my wrist. As the sun gleamed down on Willow Creek in the cool November air, the distant mountains stood out against the clear sky. While the music box and blue dress were no longer specters, but rather fragments of a tale I was acquiring, Mocha was likely dozing off on my couch at home. Hi, I'm Emily Abigail Harper Sullivan, and I've been busy tying together two families, two truths and two lives in the past several weeks. Although Clara and Robert's decisions have cast a shadow on the once warm yellow Maple Street residence, the house itself remains standing. Their love is genuine but burdened with guilt, and we occasionally meet for coffee during which they sincerely apologize. On the other hand, Maggie and Lily are now my Tuesday companions. We spend our coffee dates at a cozy cafe next to the park reminiscing about the Sullivans' Abigail's firefly-chasing adventures and the tenacity of their family. Piece by piece, memory by memory, I am healing, albeit I am not yet complete. What I learned on this journey about the letter, about DNA, and about the butterfly dress will stay with me always. That identity is not a single thread, but a tapestry, crafted from the people who love you, from the hidden houses you uncover, and from the choices you make when the ground shifts under you. It was both a crime and an act of love to take me. Despite my disorientation, I felt alive. These facts don't negate one another. Rather, they build upon one another like painterly washes, resulting in a unique, gorgeous, and chaotic masterpiece that is uniquely mine. I hope you will also remember these things that I have taught you. To begin, confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it may be. I might have ignored the letter in my mailbox had I not been forced to ask uncomfortable questions about my parents and my background. Instead, I found answers I hadn't realized I needed. You shouldn't turn a blind eye to any red flags in your life. Go farther. Identity is something you should have. Secondly, love isn't easy, but it's worth fighting for. While Clara and Robert's blunders wounded my heart, their love molded me via camping excursions and piano concerts. The love that Maggie and Lily shared remained unbroken for 25 years. Even with all their imperfections, your family is uniquely yours. Hold them close, no matter the pain. Thirdly, know that you are never truly alone. Sophie was there for me when I needed her, staying up late to check Facebook and listening to me cry. Maggie's optimism and Lily's resolve helped me persevere. Depend on your folks when life unravels. They'll point you in the right direction. I've recently launched a blog where I can share my journey and get support from those who have also grappled with issues of self-discovery. Complete strangers contact me through email, some in an effort to trace a missing brother or unravel a family mystery. The knowledge that my truth is being heard is humbling. That is the reason I am requesting that you tell me your tale. When did you last question your identity? Discovered a fact that altered the course of events? Leave a comment or shoot me an email with it. Sometimes the most unexpected moments, like over a cup of coffee on a Tuesday, when a complete stranger's comments shake you to your core, are when we uncover the truth. On occasion, I leave the rusty mug with the music box held high in my hand, listening to the gentle mountain breeze as it plays the Twinkle Twinkle song. Now the song belongs to both of us, Abigail and Emily, and serves as a constant reminder that we are one woman with many lives. Each piece of the puzzle that is life is built from experiences of love and loss, uncertainty and bravery. So never stop seeking, never stop loving. You have my whole attention as I eagerly await your narrative. If this touched you, please share it. Let us keep in mind that there are remarkable truths waiting for us even in the most mundane of circumstances.